overemphasize the impact that J. Anthony Lukas had on my generation of reporters. He was a New York Times reporter when I first knew of him, and went on to write some amazing works of nonfiction. And he took his own life as his second big book was coming out. I teach at Columbia Journalism, and most people know Columbia Journalism is the home of the Pulitzer Prizes. It's also the home of the Lukas Awards, awards that were established in memory of Tony Lukas, Kit's older brother. Kit Lukas has, in his career, as I said, has been an Emmy Award-winning television producer. He's produced and directed and written films and videos for over 50 years. He's a veteran of the newsrooms at WNET in New York and KQED in San Francisco. As a freelancer, he's produced dozens of videos on such subjects as end-of-life care, Christian-Jewish relations, and the arts. And speaking of the arts, maybe you'll hear it in his voice, he's also taken to acting at this stage in his life, and he does Shakespeare for a local company. So I'm happy to introduce Kit Lukas.
Thanks, Ari. Before I begin, I'm sure you went through this morning when you all introduced yourself, but for my sake, would you raise a hand if you have lost someone to suicide? Okay, thank you very much. And then the other thing before I begin my formal talk is I want you to hear a phrase that I'm going to say, put it in your hippocampus or wherever we store things these days. And I'll get back to it at the end of my talk. And the phrase is, postvention is prevention for the next generation. I know some of you may know that already, but for those of you who don't, it's very germane to what I'm going to talk about. 4 years ago, just about this time, I spoke to about 250 people who were therapists, students, social workers, nurses, at a conference on suicide prevention. And I said to them, you've got the wrong guy. I was the keynoter. I said, this is all wrong. I've had 5, maybe 6 suicides in my family, and 2 or 3 friends have killed themselves. I've never prevented suicide. I don't know anything about preventing suicide. And they were, this look of consternation on their face. I said, wait a minute. I have prevented a suicide. And they sat up a little bit. And I think I know how to do it. And they sat up a little more, and I said, myself, every morning I wake up, and for many, many years, despite 40 years of psychotherapy of one sort or another, I will say to myself, today is the day I want to kill myself. I'm going to die today. And sometimes I even expressed that out loud to my wife. But then I would think, I wonder what's in the refrigerator for breakfast. And I would go downstairs and start my day, and for that day, I knew I wasn't going to kill myself. And that's not a joke. I had somehow not gotten to where my relatives had gotten. My mother, my grandmother, an aunt, an uncle, and my brother. And I was able, and still am able, to go on. So I believe this talk was labeled Life After Suicide, and we'll get to that, and why I haven't killed myself a little later on. The problem is, I have to say to you also, I'm here under false pretenses. Ari called me a reporter or a journalist. I'm not. I've never considered myself one. I've run public television stations. I produced the radio and television news directors Edward R. Murrow Awards for 12 years, but I'm not a journalist. I don't know what deadlines are. I mean, I've produced shows that had to be on the air in 3 weeks, but I don't understand newspaper and blogging and internet deadlines. A book takes the amount of time it takes to write. I was never a daily journalist, and I'm not a documentarian in the sense that I think some of you would think. I do mainly arts programming, even though, as I say, I've run a public television station. But I do have something to say about suicide. that's non-journalistic. And I'll separate it into two pieces. One is the why, which you've been dealing with already this morning, and the other is survivors. The why in the aggregate is what you've been hearing about. And I was here only for the last hour, but I listened very carefully to the why. I'm interested in the why in any individual. And I thought I would because of course, journalists who have a deadline for tomorrow want to know the why. I mean, a suicide occurs, we jump to conclusions. Mary Kennedy was depressed. Oh, that's why she killed herself. Or the football star, O.J. Murdoch, 25, commits suicide. He had an Achilles heel problem and didn't report for training this year. Well, what's the assumption? That O.J. Murdoch killed himself because he had an Achilles heel problem. Well, we all have Achilles heels. And I mean that in the metaphorical as well. And there are 36,000 suicides a year in this country, not 30 million, which you would expect from the number of people who are depressed or have Achilles heels of one sort. There's a lovely thing when we were doing research for Silent Grief, we looked back at journalists and how journalists reported on suicides, and here's one from 1882, when, by the way, newspapers had no problems, even when there were only 3 or 4 pages, in talking about suicide. It wasn't until the 20th century that we stopped talking about suicide or even mentioning it. I haven't researched cancer, but I know that when my brother started journalism, no one mentioned cancer, no one put it in the papers. Maybe in the 19th century we did. Anyhow, here's something from the Denton Miller, a clerk for Wheeler Parsons and Hayes Jewelers at number 2 Maiden Lane, shot himself yesterday in the Western Hotel. He was married to Miss Cholmwell of Norwalk and 2 years later divorced. Denton had been despondent for a long while, but had seemed quite cheerful on Tuesday when he went fishing. His father said he was unable to think of any reason for the suicide. My son was in no financial trouble nor any trouble with a woman. There are mysteries when you come to any one individual. And I thought I would talk about my brother for a little bit. He didn't have bipolar. My uncle and my mother were bipolar, but my brother wasn't. He was a lifelong depressive. He wrote and always worried whether he was good enough at his writing. Don't most of us who are creating something worry if we're good enough about it? We knew that he was in danger of getting very depressed, and at one point, 10 years before his death, or maybe, I had dinner with him and he was in such bad shape, I said, either I'll take you to a hospital now or you'll go yourself tomorrow. Tell me which it's going to be. He went to the hospital. He went to a psychopharmacologist. He got started on treatment. And for 10 years, he was without, I won't say without major depression, but without suicidal ideation, as far as I could tell. Then he finished Big Trouble, ironic, the title of the book, which was his 5th book. He had some trouble with it early on. He had to rearrange things, but don't we all when we're writing? He finished it. We went to theater, saw Miss Julie, I think it was. The Doll's House. Wonderful time. We had a great dinner, talking with each other about how we used to go to theater all the time as kids and in college, and what a wonderful thing it was. And 2 weeks later, he was dead. So why did my brother die by suicide? And I think the questions that came from the press were, unfortunately, not very insightful. He was so successful, how could he kill himself? He was so intelligent, how could he be depressed? These were members, I hesitate to tell you what newspapers they were with. Only the business editor of the Times had a reliable insight. She said to me, and I refused all interviews, but I was willing to listen to her. She said, he worked to keep himself alive. As long as he was writing, I think he was able to stay alive. And when he finished the book, the room was empty. Now, I think that was an insight, but of course it's only a piece of it. We had blue genes. There's just no doubt about it. There is some genetic loading towards depression in our family. We were all depressed, all of us. And my father was an alcoholic. So when the doctor said to him, don't drink anymore or it'll kill you, and he kept drinking, I guess that's like the anorexic. It did kill him. It wasn't suicide in the sense that we're talking about it here. So he had the blue genes, but of course when he was 2 years old, or a little less, when he was 1 year old, my mother tried to kill herself and went away, so he had no mother for 6 months. And then when he was 8 and I was 6, our mother killed herself, and my father got sent away with tuberculosis, and we got sent away to boarding school. So there was a certain amount of abandonment that my brother felt and never talked about and never went into therapy. Because what, journalists don't do that? I don't do that, he doesn't, I don't know, but he didn't. And he once asked me, why are you so obsessed with death? That was when I was writing, I forget which book. I said, I'm not obsessed with death, I'm obsessed with life. He didn't get it. But I want to tell you something serendipitous and a little frightening to me. This is a copy of my book I brought with me. There are 20 on the shelf. When I opened this up 5-10 minutes ago, I found a letter from my brother. It's only the 3rd or 4th letter he ever wrote me about personal things. Everything else was from the Congo or from... Dear Kit, March 16th, 1988. An hour ago, I read the last page of Silent Grief. I sat for that time with tears trickling the corners of my eyes, thinking back over 54 years of life, thinking of Mother and Dad, Francis and Ira, Missy, Judy, Baba and Anna, and most of all, you and me. Your lucid and eloquent prose has stirred in me feelings which I've long repressed. As you know, I do constant battle against silent grief, sometimes succumbing to it as I did last year. That's when I was helping him. Sometimes holding it at bay with an arsenal of defenses I've assembled over the years. I've fled from the pain of our youths and the melancholy which it has bred in me by funneling all my energies into the written page, often at great cost to the rest of me. So he did have remarkable insight that none of us thought he had. And after his suicide, when people said, well, did he talk about your mother's death? No. These things were in him, but bottled up. But I think there was even a more wonderful insight from someone who wrote for the Writers Guild, Authors Guild, which is it, Writers Guild or Authors Guild? I can't remember. Magazine, which said, she said, a lot of writers can't bear the silence after the book is finished. There is no applause. You've got to wait. As an actor, it's wonderful. You finish, the play and there's applause. Or boos, it doesn't matter. There's immediate Tony was sitting with, I don't know whether my 9 years' work is worth anything or not, and there's no one to applaud. So I think with my brother, and I suspect with many people, if not most, who kill themselves, it's what psychologists call overdetermined. There are many, many things that get in the way of self-worth, and there are many, many things that lead people to die by suicide. And perhaps the more complicated and intelligent you are, the more things it takes. Anyhow, he killed himself. But the story for me, as you can imagine, is about what it is to be a survivor. And I want to spend my remaining time talking about that. There are millions of us, millions. Bob Gebbia, who I don't think is here, oh, there you are, said at the last conference that I was at, and on a videotape that I've seen, that a huge percent, is it 60 or 70% of us will know someone? 4 out of 5 people will, during their lifetime, will know someone who killed themselves. Well, that goes way beyond what Ed Schneidman, the doyen of suicidology, said, which was that there are perhaps 5 survivors for every suicide. You don't get to 80% by having only 5 survivors. You have the high school with the 700 people who knew the kid who killed himself. You have the soldiers in the platoon. You have the parents, the grandparents, the uncles, the aunts. Now, whether all these people are similarly affected by suicide, probably impossible to say, but there are millions of us. And the question is, what happens to us? And that's what I've spent the last 25 years writing about and thinking about, and you can see the reason why, with 5, 6 suicides in my family and my best childhood friend. I had to be affected by it. I was diagnosed as having PTSD. When Henry first was writing the book with me, and I told him the symptoms of survivors that John McIntosh and others had come up with, and he said, we have a term for that in psychology. It's post-traumatic stress disorder. And he went out to an American Psychological Association meeting and broached that, and the Veterans Associations were very angry. That was their term for what happened to them. It was not to be applied to others. And yet, it's clear that PTSD is one of the things that some survivors can have. I was depressed most of my life. I was diagnosed as a depressive, but someone else recently diagnosed me with PTSD. And it made sense, because when my wife died 4 years ago, I was set back into the same mode as I'd been after my brother's death and after my uncle's death and after my grandmother's death. Flashbacks, numbness, all the symptoms of PTSD. Nightmares, sweats. But what else do survivors have going for them? Well, let's see. First of all, guilt. If I dropped by his house yesterday, he wouldn't have killed himself. I felt that with my brother. He came back from a trip. I didn't talk to him for 2 days, and then he was dead. Oh my God, if I'd called him, if I'd seen him. I don't know a survivor I've spoken to who doesn't feel some of that guilt. Anger. First of all, anger at the doctors who didn't do their job, right? Wrong drug, wrong this, wrong that. Secondly, angry at the wife. You know, why didn't she see that? Or at the husband, or at the brother, or at the sister, or at the mother. Or on the job, couldn't they tell he was depressed? Anger at the person who killed himself. That's a little harder to recognize, those of you who have been through this. You may not immediately know or feel safe or comfortable feeling angry. I was really angry at my brother. I'd had a wonderful evening. My wife had been at a great party, and I came home and got the phone call, went back into the city. And I was really angry at him. How dare he take himself away? One of my daughters was to graduate law school the next week. He had said he would be there. They were angry at him, my daughters, and I was really angry at him. The 5 people who were sitting around his living room that afternoon, that evening, did not understand my anger. For them, this was the first suicide. And they couldn't bring themselves to that anger, because how can you be angry at someone who hurts so much, who is so sick? Well, you can be. I have not seen enough in the media about the survivors. Suicide prevention is key, if for no other reason. You don't want to multiply the survivors. So the fewer suicides there are, the fewer suicide survivors. But I have not seen a major television show or a documentary or a piece in the newspapers about survivors. There are quite a few books now. Before ours, there was Albert Caine, who had a book of essays. There was a man named John Hewitt, a minister. Those were before we wrote our book. And after our book, there are now quite a few books, many books, about what it's like to be a survivor. But I haven't seen the press take this up. And I don't understand why. Because it seems to me that with the fact that some survivors are bound to be depressed and may kill themselves, with the effect on health, because a lot of survivors get very sick because they translate their depression into and their anger into illness, and there's data on this. This is a major health problem in the United States. For instance, I watched CNN the other week, and there were two wives of soldiers who had died by suicide. And they were on camera, and they were interviewed, but not a word about how they were doing, or what they went through, or what their family was going through. It was all about the soldiers. And that's a major problem. But the hundreds of people left behind in just that small constellation of two women and two soldiers, that's also a serious problem. When you interview survivors, don't assume they have their wits about them. Don't assume they have any idea as to why a loved one or a friend killed himself. They're in shock. I wouldn't ask why, and I wouldn't ask how, but your newspapers or your television station or your blog are going to want to know how and why. And you have a lovely piece of paper, and they're telling you what to do and what not to do, and I won't go into that. What's the hardest thing to live with? Guilt. Not the anger, because I can express that, but guilt. I should have done something. Now, I was 6.5 when my mother died. How could a 6.5-year-old feel guilty? Oh, they're very good at it. So are 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds, 10-year-olds. After all, what have they been told? If you do something bad will happen. And if you don't know, what you didn't do or did do, it's very easy to feel guilty. So from my point of view, it's the kids who are most at risk. Which brings me to the title of this piece, which I didn't come up with, I assume Kate did. Life After Suicide. Why haven't I killed myself? Aside from the fact I like to eat and I go down to breakfast. And I think there's some lessons here. I want to make sure I don't overstay my time. No, it's only 23 and 56 tenths of a second or whatever. One, I was lucky to go to a college where I was forced to take a course in psychology. And I had a great teacher. He was the greatest teacher I've ever had. And his lesson on Freud really interested me. And so I, became a psych major. And in my senior year, I came down with severe psychosomatic stomach problems. I won't go into the details, but severe. And so I went to the school psychiatric consultant who came once a week, saw everyone for 15 minutes, and he said, I think you need some help. And so early enough, not as early as it should have been, I should have had intervention at the age of 6.5, but early enough, I started into this long process of examining what it was that was causing problems. I was also blessed with ADHD. I have to get out of bed in the morning. I have to go do things. I don't have a film, I've got to go do one. I don't have a book to write, I got to write one. It was a blessing. Yes, I was depressed, but I was also always had to do something. And doing things got in the way of the depression. When I'm editing, video editing, I'm not depressed. When I'm writing, I'm not depressed. I got into therapy because of the trauma and the damage, and I continued probing and questioning. Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry. And continuing therapy. And whenever, as Dr. Clayton said, whenever I felt depressed again, I went back into therapy. I didn't give up. In fact, okay, I'm going to push it. I wrote a book about that. It's called Shrink Wrap. It's a guide to psychotherapy from a frequent flyer. And it's on Amazon. No publisher would publish it because I didn't have a PhD or a CSW or an MD after my name. You know how it goes. Or maybe you don't, but try writing a book about something biological, and if you don't have an MD or a PhD, they won't publish it. It tells why one has to go back to therapy over and over again during a lifetime of stress and problems. It is not a panacea. It is a working education that you can get for yourself. I was lucky to have a good marriage and wonderful children. And once that happens, and once you have some insight about yourself, the idea of killing myself and leaving my family with that behind was impossible. So no matter how depressed I got, no matter how when I was driving back home across the George Washington Bridge, I thought how easy it would be to turn the wheel, or on the Palisades Parkway, or getting up in the morning and think today's the day, when Susan goes downstairs for her coffee. But that didn't work. I always had to bring her coffee in bed. So I had to go downstairs first, and then I was off on my day. What else? Stubbornness, perhaps. Courage, perhaps. A desire to see what tomorrow would bring, or whether I could make it to 80 years old. All these things helped. They're no answer. And they're as specific to me as the reasons my brother killed himself are specific to him. But I give them to you because I think I have lived a good life after suicide. Some really obnoxious reviewer of Blue Jeans, who I don't think finished the book, said in his review in The Observer in New York, "Oh, yeah, so how did Lukas stay alive? It was his ego." Yeah, no. I stood alive through a lot of dumb luck and those other things I mentioned. Okay, Ari, your turn.
Okay. Let me start out by saying I did finish the book. I couldn't put it down. And I want to talk a little bit about your childhood experience. You were not only told that you were only not told that your mother committed suicide, you weren't even told she was dead at first.
I have to interrupt you.
Yeah.
Committed suicide is a no-no.
Okay.
All right?
Okay.
We didn't commit a crime. She killed herself.
Okay.
Okay. All right.
As a writer, I take note, and I hope all the journalists in the room will do the same. You were not told that your mother was dead. You were sent away to camp.
I was told she was dead, but that she'd been sick and she died. Whew. Boy, there's a thing. What, she had a cold and she died? Yeah.
And then it was 10 years before your father mentioned the word suicide. Today, as you noted, there's a much greater openness to suicide. We talk about it. We have therapy sessions. When something happens in a school or something happens in a family, we call in the troops, we call in the support system, we call in the experts. We're aware of clusters, we're aware of contagion. But yet, the suicide rate, as we heard this morning, is still climbing. This continues to be a problem. How has the openness in the conversation changed the climate? Or has it changed the climate? Are we doing, I mean, you told us some things we could do better, but
Are we doing the right thing, or are we doing the
right
wrong
thing?
thing by talking about it? Because that was, of course, the old myth. If you talk about it, don't bring it up, that person will kill himself. And I've been talking about it ad nauseum my whole life, and the kids around the dinner table eventually got tired of that, let me tell you. I'm not a scientist. I don't have the studies. I was prepared to come in today to say that the rate per 1,000 had not climbed, and then I did some more research and found out that it had. Actually, not as much. I mean, 25 years ago when we wrote Silent Grief, I think there were 32,000 suicides a year. And I wonder, with the number of suicides in the Army, whether some of the data isn't being skewed. But yes, the suicide rate has not dropped as much as anyone would like it to. I don't know if talking about it hurts. I don't see how it can, but I'm not an expert.
what about writing about it? We
Well,
know
it's
that-
good for us.
Well, good for us, but bad writing can hurt. Bad writing can, as we heard this morning, if you talk about methods, people will get ideas. If there are role models in society who commit suicide, and we write about them, and we talk about that they killed themselves and how they did it. From your experience, what can good writing about suicide do? How can it help? What's been the experience of writing Silent Grief and Blue Jeans? Have you heard from people who said, this was important in my life, or this saved my
Well,
life, or this
I
helped me
have
understand?
actually had at least 2 or 3 times a month, I will get a letter about, interestingly, Silent Grief, but sometimes about Blue Jeans. You have saved my life by showing me that I am not going crazy. And one of the things survivors needed to know was that they were experiencing something that millions of others had experienced. Whether that really saved their life, I don't know, but I've had people say that to me. It certainly saved my life. There's no doubt that if I wasn't able to write about it, when my closest childhood friend killed himself in 1984, I was teaching at City College. I got very depressed, and my wife said, I think it has to do with your mother's suicide. Go to the biology library or the psych library and look up a book. And I'm sure there are books on what it's like to be left behind by suicide. There were none. There was Albert Cain's book, and then John Hewitt's. And then she said, you have to write about it. There's no doubt. I mean, and I don't think I am revealing anything terribly untoward here, because it's on the back of the book, but Bill Moyer's, I'm sorry again, I really do apologize. Bill Moyer's brother killed himself when he was quite young, I believe. And Bill wrote, I have waited a long time for this book. The secret grief that is at the soul of every survivor is in its own way a killer. The message of this book is redemptive. Life begins anew when silence ends. Lukas says this telling of the story helped him. Now he has helped me. I don't know whether that's true or not, but it makes you feel good when you've written a book like this to hear it.
Mm-hmm. If I have the dates right, it took you about 10 years to write Blue Jeans after your brother died.
I had learned to write more slowly.
Many of us don't have that luxury. You're talking to a room with
Right.
many journalists who
Right.
have to cover a story today, have to tell the world, have to deal with their editors, have to get the news out quickly. So it's a two-part question. One is, talk about the meditative process that you went through to write the book, and why it took you that amount of time. You probably didn't set out to take 10
No
years.
meditation. I started writing a week later, just putting down feelings and thoughts, and it went through just transmogrification after transmogrification, and I wrote a 450-page book, and then asked my agent to look at it, and she did and said, well, maybe, yeah, I don't know. And then I sent it out, and people said no. And so there was very little meditation. There were a lot of no's, a lot of editors. And then finally, my agent came back to me and said, well, you know, why don't you cut this book down? Why don't you make it a memoir, not an encyclopedia? It was just work. It wasn't meditation. It wasn't hesitation. And it was trying to find the right form, which is true for all writers. What is the form that tells this story best?
But the second part of that question is, what advice do you have for people who have to write under pressure and don't have, I'll call it the luxury of time?
None.
To tell the
I
story.
don't know. I don't know.
But you can't tell your editor none. You can't say, no, I'm not going to write this story.
No,
you have to write a story
that's
for
why
tomorrow.
you have to learn. You have to prepare. You have to know yourself ahead of time. And you have to know what you want to write about. Is it just the facts, ma'am? Am I just going to write, he died and here's how he did it? Or we don't know why he did it? Or is this an opportunity to tell another story? To tell the story about survivors? Or to tell the story about education? I mean, I don't know, but I know that if you think about it ahead of time, if you're prepared as a writer, I studied math, and one of the best jobs I ever had was doing a college-level course of advanced calculus on television. If I hadn't prepared, I would have been fired like the rest of the station staff. I was one of only 2 producers kept on that summer. So I was prepared. You gotta know your subject matter. And so if you throw this story to the business editor of the Times or to someone else and says, write this, maybe you have to have the guts to say, I'm not prepared for this. I don't have the knowledge. Get yourself a science editor. Get yourself a religious writer. Get yourself this. Yeah, that's impractical. And you'll get fired. Or you'll get told, don't ever do that. Once I was told to go up the mast of a ship and paint the mast. I said, I'm afraid of heights. He said, on a ship, on a boat, you don't get a chance to say that. Go up there. I didn't go. He couldn't throw me off. I was only 15.
I like your suggestion about writing about survivors, and I think that has an impact on readers, because people thinking about suicide will think about, what am I going to leave behind? And I could see in this story what it did to a family, what it did to a school, what it did to a unit. I am not prepared to do that, but how much time does a survivor need? How much, and what questions would you ask?
Well, as you say, for 10 years I didn't know that I was a survivor of suicide. I knew I was guilty, angry, frightened. Something bad had happened, more bad things would happen. And when my father told me, it was only 5 minutes before I had to catch a train. He was very clever and told me at a train station, you know your mother killed herself, don't you? And when I said no, he really got a shock. He had hoped someone else had told me. That I was 16. How old am I now? 77. It takes that long.
What questions would you ask of a survivor?
Oh, if I were a reporter?
If you were a reporter.
How long has it taken you to realize that you're like others, that this isn't only your experience, that there are others like you? How long has it taken you to realize that even though you're like others, you have your own very important personal story that you want to tell and need to tell? And I guess then the third question would be, how much therapy have you had?
In the book, you describe a family, and I think one of the reasons that the book is so compelling, and I'm talking about Blue Jeans here, that is familiar to me. It's an upwardly mobile, secular Jewish family that has its problems and has had romances and has some successes and some failures. And then toward maybe a third of the way in the book, you see that things are going to go bad and things are going to take a bad turn. But what struck me as I was reading it, I thought, well, this could be my family. And often we may imagine that this happens, it doesn't happen in our kind of family. It happens, to other people. But the the closeness to, the reader's experience was very, very, very sharp for me. But I wonder, as you go through life and meet people, meet family, hear stories, do you see certain trouble signs? Do you see certain triggers? Do you see certain warnings that you would not have seen if you had not had this experience in your own life?
I don't know, because the question always is, whether you're a therapist or a journalist, what's your intuition? What's your sensitivity? My wife, who was a novelist and then an ombudsman and then a playwright, became a psychotherapist, and she was extraordinarily good. Yes, she had some training, but I think that it was her basic empathic nature and her, I'll use the word intuition, whatever that is, and I think the same is true with me. I don't know that I learned anything. I think I know with my kids, when they needed therapy, I felt it, I knew it. If I walk into a room and someone is perpetually angry, I want to know why. I'm not sure I learned anything specific from having 6 suicides in my family. And I didn't know my uncle, who was bipolar, was going to kill himself in his 70s. He'd done very well on lithium. I didn't know that my aunt, when she got cancer, was going to hoard sleeping pills. And I didn't know that my brother, even though he was very depressed at 64, was going to kill himself. Now, my wife said she knew. And she knew not because she was a therapist, but she was a therapist because she knew.
You described that last family meal in the book and going to a doll's house, and Tony was very generous. I think he paid for everyone, and he just seemed at the top of the world. Is that sometimes a warning sign?
I don't see him here. Yes, Dr. Nook. Myth. It's a myth that if someone who has been terribly depressed suddenly gets very happy about life, that's a warning sign. It's a myth. Okay. So, no, it's not a warning sign.
And we have it from the expert. I want to engage all of you, and I'd love to hear some questions for Kit. Yes.
Yes. Well, wait a minute. That's my good ear.
Thank you very much for your writing. And I wanted to ask you, we discussed earlier that there's therapy that helps and therapy that doesn't. And I'm not looking for you to say these are the 5 things, but in your own experience, are there words that you can put to what the helpful therapy feels like, or how you, what happens inside you?
Yeah, I had psychopharmacologists over some part of the time. I still take a small amount of Effexor. It's mainly a non-clinical dose, but it's superstitious. That works. Superstition works. I was in analysis. My first therapist was a bona fide Freudian analyst. Because of my training in psychology, I believed in that. I was going to be get my own PhD, but I got bored. That's the ADHD. I think that helped me to understand that I was very masochistic, that I was blaming myself for everything, so that worked. Then my second therapist was also an analyst. In New York. Boy, I'm getting my timeline mixed up. Actually, my first analyst My first therapist was in California, and she fell asleep during therapy sessions. She wanted me to go to be analyzed. I said no. And so that was not helpful. Either her falling asleep during sessions, which may have been her defense, but certainly didn't help. Then this analyst in LA. Then in New York, when I fell apart after a major success in television, I realized I needed some help, and I got a very rigid Freudian analyst. He was quiet for an hour, I was quiet for an hour, that went on for 5 years. That was not helpful. Then my next therapist, when I became depressed again about 10 years later, did a lot of work with kids, and that was very helpful. He understood genesis of problems. But he didn't understand suicide. And that, it seems to me like if you've been sexually abused and you go to an analyst who doesn't understand sexual abuse, you may not get as much help as you need. All right, so he retired. And I thought, I'm okay now. I really am okay. And then my wife died. And I called a close friend who is a psychologist. I said, I need someone right away. And she gave me the name of a woman who is the daughter-in-law of one of Freud's disciples, and the most eclectic, wonderful therapist I ever had, because the first thing she said to me when I came in and said I'd crashed my car 5 minutes after my wife died, she said, yes, everything is crashing, isn't it? And then I said, it's not fair what's happened to me, and certainly not in the last week. And she said, no, it's not fair. You're absolutely right. She understood me on a level that no one else had understood me. And when I was ready to quit therapy, several times over the past 4 years, she said, I'm not ready to throw in the towel yet, but if you want to quit, that's entirely up to you. I don't think that was paradoxical intervention. It's a wonderful phrase. Look it up, guys. It's terrific stuff. I don't think it was paradoxical intervention. I think it was honest. I don't want to have you in therapy if you don't. But she said, I think we have ways to go now. That faith in me and her basic understanding of the pain I'd gone through, she's a woman in her 70s, and the fact that she had ovarian cancer during our time together and had to take time off and still wanted to work with me. I think all those things were helpful. That's the best I can do.
Yes.
I noticed when you corrected Mr. Goldman on the use of the phrase committed suicide instead of died by suicide, there were like 4 tweets in 1 minute or 2 minutes. What other problematic language do you see in the media surrounding this issue?
I don't think it's the language for me so much as it is what you ask as your first question. When I approach people, when we were interviewing people for the book, I said, tell me about your situation. Not when did it happen, how did it die, blah, 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 blah. In other words, I did what I do when I do television interviewing. I said, tell me about it. Then I have all sorts of questions stored up, details. No one has ever said anything to me or asked me a question that was offensive. But I do think the writing that makes it appear to be a simple matter to find out how to prevent suicide or why it happened, that writing doesn't need to be used. Don't make it sound simple, because God knows you're here for 2 days because it's not simple. And I'm here for all these years because it's not simple. That's the best I can do.
We've talked a little bit about how to talk to a survivor, and also what not to assume a survivor knows about the person who killed themselves. Do you see the story of the person who killed themselves and the story of the survivor as different stories or one story?
forgive me, I'm going to sit down because I'm not used to standing for that long. Thank you. Is this mic on? Yes, okay. I don't want to say something corny, but in some sense there is no differentiation between your story and my story, and all of us. But as a journalist, as a reporter, I do think you have an opportunity to go beyond the what, why now. I mean, journalism has gone beyond the what, why. And just as I did, I could have talked today about all the whys of all the people in my family who killed themselves and all my friends. I chose to talk about myself and survivorship. But my brother was a survivor. And my uncle, the brother of my mother, was a survivor. So those stories are tangled, are intertwined. So yes, there are different things to say about survivors than about people who kill themselves, but you always have to look for the entanglement. My brother was abandoned by his mother. He was a survivor, just like I was, of that suicide. My uncle was the brother of a woman who he dearly loved. He was 2 years younger, who killed herself. So the story is like that. Does that help?
Yes.
I want to take the opportunity, since we have a video maker, I want to take the opportunity to really ask about images and storytelling through images around suicide.
There have been some really good films about people who have killed themselves. As I said, none that I know of about survivors. Oh, there's one, but it wasn't very good, one or two. There may be many others, I just don't know. The best one I've seen about the death of the suicide of someone was a filmmaker whose name, of course, escapes me. Joanne probably remembers her name. It was on HBO, and I think it was called Boy Lost or Boy Interrupted or something. And it was good because it looked at, it threw away the easy answers. The images were all typical documentary stuff, but it threw away how did it happen. More it was, could we have stopped it? What was he like? When did we see the signs and all that? There was a wonderful piece about the Holocaust and about films about the Holocaust written by a Columbia University professor many years ago who said, the problem with films about the Holocaust is they're all beautiful. The images are all, they want to shoot these gorgeous shots. And he said, how can you shoot gorgeous pictures of terrible things? It's wrong. It beautifies the Holocaust. And I feel somewhat the same way about suicide. That I don't want filmy stuff. I don't want mist coming through. I think I love talking heads. I did a lot of talking heads. And I'll let you in on a little secret. I've made a film about my own life, suicide and cancer. It's all talking heads. It's all me. I shot it. I directed it. I produced it. I did the sound. I did the editing. And I'm trying to get it out there. It's not gorgeous. And it's all talking heads. It's all interview, but it's an interview with me. And I think that's the best way. Just ask people. Just let them talk. Shoot it well enough so that people want to stay with it. You know, this lighting isn't good. It was better over there. But you're still listening to me. So it's the words that are important.
Dr. Gould this morning spoke about the Papageno effect, right? A character in a Mozart opera who decides not to commit suicide, and how that story's got to be told. One part of your life in recent years has been to be an actor, Shakespearean actor. Has that helped you cope with suicidal thoughts, or like, do you draw inspiration from any Shakespearean characters?
Nope, I just have fun.
some people get on stage and they want to kill themselves. I mean, they're so nervous, right? The acting, the curtain goes up.
I love it.
That's more stress. But
No,
you feel no stress?
Look, my mother was a Shakespearean actress. Maybe that has something to do with it. She was starting a career, and then she got married, and the doctor said, "Oh, you're better off not being an actor. You're better off having a home." And so she had to express herself somehow in that fashion. So she had my brother and myself write little plays, and when we were 4, 5, 6 years old, and we performed them for her, and she applauded. Now, anyone of, I talked about applause earlier, so there's another factor. The applause stopped when my mother died, and the applause stops when you stop working and stop writing. It's all a continuum, but no, I loved getting up on the stage and showing off. I loved it. And you can tell, I'm not embarrassed to be a show-off here.
We have time for one more question if anybody has. Well, you've both asked already, so go ahead.
Sir, thank you for talking to us. I'm not a therapist. I'm not a mental health expert. I feel very comfortable in an interview situation, but except for this kind of situation, and I wonder, especially interviews with perhaps people who have attempted, or the survivors themselves, I know have been some very emotional encounters, and I don't want to trigger greater difficulty than they can bear, and I also don't want to put my hand over their mouth when they want to say something, and I just wondered if you had thoughts on that.
It's a very good question and a very germane one, and I have 3 very short things to say about it. I did a series called The World of Abnormal Psychology for public television, 13 shows, and one of the segments was on psychopaths. And we went up to a prison in Rhode Island, and we were let in, and then here I was. The camera's here, the lights are there, we're in the room, and there's a murderer sitting there, and I have to ask him questions. And I wasn't used to asking murderers questions, and so I fudged around it, and finally said, "You want to know what happened? You want to know who and I killed that guy? And I'll tell you." So, first of all, your interviewee does want to talk. Secondly, and maybe there are only 2 things here. I think of my friend Raphael Abramovitz, who was a lawyer and who was an NBC producer and did really important documentaries. And he was up at the Veterans Hospital during the Vietnam War, and he was talking to paraplegics and quadriplegics. And I came up to do some still photography and to watch him interview. I'd never seen him interview before. And he was asking them really personal questions. What's it like not to be able to comb your hair? What's it like not to have sex? And afterwards I said, "Raphael, how do you have the guts to ask that question?" He said, "First of all, it's the job you do. And secondly, if you're nervous and afraid, you're not going to give them the opportunity to talk about the things they really want to talk about." Oh, and I guess the third thing is I haven't met a survivor yet who doesn't want to tell his or her story. Don't be afraid of asking questions or just opening it up. The best questions I ask are always the ones at the end of the interview when I say to people, "Is there anything I haven't touched?" And then I sit back and they go.
According to the schedule, we now have a 15-minute break, but I'd like to thank Lukas.